In my late teen years, I worked the night shift at a campground one summer. My shift was from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m., basically because everyone was sleeping for a majority of my shift. My job was mainly to be present in the event that there was ever an emergency. It was a pretty easy job, so most of the time I could scroll away on my phone or play video games to keep myself awake. My very first night on the job, I was paired up with a guy who had just put in his 2 weeks' notice. One of his final official duties was to train me. He gave me the lay of the land, told me where security cameras were located, the main responsibilities of the position, and who to call if there were ever a reason to call anybody. Towards the end of his whole speech, and almost offhandedly, he told me about the payphone nearby on the property. This was in 2016, so the idea of a payphone already seemed ancient to me, as I could only ever recall seeing a handful of them in my life. I had all but tuned him out until he said that this phone rang every night at 2:17 a.m., and it had for as long as he worked there. He said that it kind of unnerved him the first few nights he heard it, but after a while, it began to be something that was easy to just pass off as background noise. Funny enough, there was no story as to why it rang, just that it did, which piqued my curiosity more than just a little bit. My training came and went. This guy's final 2 weeks went as well, and the next thing I know, it's my time up in the show. I was the main guy on site until about 6 a.m. when non-overnight camp workers began to file in. Nights themselves were pretty boring if I'm being honest. Most of the time, I'd simply sit at my post doing monotonous things, doing my best to will my eyes to stay open. But I'd be damned if at every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., that damn phone would ring. Even tucked away in the camp office, during the silence of the night, I could hear it ringing out near the parking lot. The first few times, it jolted me awake, but after a while, it became expected. Most nights, I just let it ring and tried my best to ignore it. Easy enough because whoever was on the other end only called one time, so it would fire off about 8 rings total, and that was it for the night. I'm now about a month into working there. It was smack dab in the middle of summer, and even in the dead of night, it was still excruciatingly hot out. So I began to make a habit of opening one of the office windows to get cool air into the building. But because the window was now open, the payphone was much louder than it usually was, almost annoyingly so. I think that may have been what pushed me over the edge. I decided then that I was going to answer it. I set an alarm for 2:15 a.m. so I could walk out a couple of minutes before it was set to go off, and I could answer on the first or second ring. To this day, I'm not really sure what I was expecting. Part of me just wanted whoever was on the other line, someone who hadn't gotten a response before, to be surprised when they heard me say, "Hello?" Like clockwork, the phone rang right at the stroke of 2:17. I answered it, and before saying anything, I listened. There was no sound, just dead air, like there was someone on the other line, but they weren't saying anything either. I eventually said hello, as I had planned to do. I even said it 3 or 4 times when I didn't get a response, before finally hanging up. For all the buildup that I had mentally placed on this moment, it was a resounding bust. I decided to do this every night for a week, but always got the same result. Eventually, I stopped thinking anything of it, and left it alone after that for about a month, resigning myself to the notion that maybe it was a glitch in the phone company's system that made it ring, or some sort of timer within the payphone. I didn't really have a clue though. About a month later, I'm getting close to the end of my contract at the camp. I still hear that phone ring every night, and I'm still a bit curious as to why. I set another alarm, and when the time came, The phone rang, and I answered it once again. I repeatedly said hello into the phone, starting friendly at first, then ending up a bit forceful with my inflection. I figured it was just like before, but right when I moved to hang up the receiver, I heard what sounded like someone laughing. Not so much like something was funny, but more of something between a chuckle and a scoff. When out of nowhere, the low voice on the other end of the phone started repeating my full name back to me, over and over again, gradually getting faster and faster with each pass. This not only shocked me, but absolutely scared me out of my shorts. I slammed the phone so hard, it made a residual ringing sound in the nighttime air. I couldn't move at first. My heart was beating like I had just run a mile. And that's when the phone rang again. At this point, I was even more freaked because the phone had never rung twice in a single night. I picked the phone up and hung it up as fast as I could just to get the ringing to stop. I waited near the phone just to see if it would ring again, but it didn't. After a few moments of calming myself, I reflected on what limited knowledge I had about payphones. I knew you had to insert change to make a call. Duh. I had also remembered hearing my parents say that there was some code that you could input to phones that would allow you to redial a number that had just called you. But what was the code again? After pondering it for a moment, I remembered. *69. I had some change on me, so fueled by curiosity, and perhaps against my better judgment, I dropped a quarter in and hit those 3 keys. After I dialed, there were a few clicking sounds that I heard as the phone tried to connect me, but I was then met by an automated voice.
We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service.
I continued working at this job till the end of summer, and that phone kept ringing every night at the same time. But never again did I have the nerve to answer it. Almost 10 years later, I still wonder about this. Why every night at 2:17? How did that person know my entire name? And most pressingly, who was that person on the other end of that phone? My family lived in Washington State. Our house had this huge backyard that was surrounded by woods on all sides. It was just over 2 acres and had enough open grass to play any sports we kids wanted to. I had my friends over pretty often since I had the best backyard for us to play in. It was a Friday in the summer when I was in maybe the 6th or 7th grade. My friends and I wanted to have a camp-out sleepover in my backyard. I was a Boy Scout, so I had just learned how to put up a tent on my own and wanted to show off my skills. We had a couple of tents at the house, so Andrew, Mike, and Nick came over at around 5 p.m. after getting permission from their parents to spend the night. I remember the time because we wanted enough daylight where we still had hours to play in the yard before building a fire and heading off to sleep. My parents ordered pizza for us after we had played for a few hours, and then we built a fire in our fire pit. The sun was starting to go down, and so it was time to set up the tents before it got too dark out. We got the tents up fairly quickly because my friends kind of helped, but I remember doing most of the work. By the time the task was done, it was pretty dark out in the backyard, but our outdoor lights were giving off a nice glow, which made it perfect for our purposes. It was now dark enough for us to play our favorite game, Manhunt. I know this is a game that maybe other people haven't heard of, so think of it as hide and seek, but done in pairs or teams. There were tons of spots to hide in the backyard, so we played in duos. It was Mike and myself hiding first, and Andrew and Nick would be the ones hunting us. Mike and I split up. Our goal was to be able to get back to home base without getting found out by our friends. Home base was the blue tent. You actually had to hide away from home base, no camping nearby would be allowed. We had this trampoline that was in the far corner of our yard, just before the edge of the woods, so I crawled under that to hide. When the hunters would start looking, they had to blow a whistle to let the hiders know that they were beginning. Once I heard the whistle, I stayed under the trampoline, waiting it out, watching the two of them off in the distance, looking around. I was waiting for a good moment to start my creep back towards the blue tent. I had my sights on the fire pit, which was pretty close to the base. If I could make it over to the fire pit unseen, I could beeline it for the tent. So when both Andrew and Nick had their backs to me, looking in different areas of the backyard, I sprinted towards the fire pit, and just as I landed behind it, I heard one of the trash bins alongside of our house almost topple over. I noticed our motion detecting light on the side of the house turn on as well, but I hadn't seen anyone come out of the house to trigger that light. I went to peek around the corner to the side yard, and that's when I saw a tall man, dressed in dark clothes, speed walking away in the direction of the woods. Just as I was thinking about investigating further, my dad came out and called us all in for ice cream. We suspended the game of manhunt, put out the fire, and headed into the house through the back door for some sweet refreshment. Once we got inside, I told my dad about the side light being triggered. My dad went out into the yard and looked into the woods, but didn't see anything on that side of the house. He went around to the front yard to check for people on our property, weird cars, or anything of the sort. But he didn't see anything there either. My friends and I enjoyed the ice cream. Then we went upstairs to play PlayStation for a bit. My dad eventually came into my room and told us that it might be a good idea to sleep inside tonight after the side light went off and I saw that man walking around. We were bummed since we had already put up the tents and had planned to sleep outside. My friends and I talked about just going back outside and sleeping in the tent since they were already set up anyway. And plus, what were the odds that whoever that was still out there hours later? Once my folks were asleep for the night, we quietly crept outside, doing our best to not wake them. We weren't exactly hiding the fact that we were going back out there, but we didn't want to advertise it either. We each had a sleeping bag. Mike and I shared a tent, while Andrew and Nick shared the other. After a while of joking around and yelling things between tents, we started to quiet down and eventually tried to go to sleep. I wasn't asleep yet, but as I think back, it seems like Mike was. I started hearing walking sounds in the grass, approaching the tent, and then the zipper to the tent was unzipped. I looked up and saw my dad in the darkness peering inside the tent. He said, "What are you guys doing out here?" I replied to him something like, "They wanted to sleep out here, so we came back out." But as my eyes adjusted, I took a closer look at the face looking down at me before realizing that it wasn't my dad at all. It was some complete stranger. He looked like he was leaning down to come in when I screamed bloody murder and woke each one of my friends up, as well as probably half the block. Mike began to scream as well. The man grabbed both of our ankles and uttered to be quiet. But as our porch light shot on and the back door swung open, he gave up when he realized he was about to be exposed. He backed away from the tent in a hurry and rushed off into the woods. We all bolted up to run inside the house, just as my dad was making his way out the back door in response to our screams. I told him that I didn't know which way the guy went, but that the man from earlier was back. My dad ran around the yard screaming and taunting the creep to come back, but we didn't see him again. We all went inside and called the police. Once the police got there, they didn't really do much of anything, other than take a report and advise us that we shouldn't sleep outside anymore. We all got a stern talking to by my parents about how they had told us to stay inside, that we were lucky, and we were probably done camping out for a while. They were right, because after my parents spoke to Mike, Nick, and Andrew's parents about what had happened, even sleeping over inside was off the table for a while. It was dumb of us to go against what my parents had said, but I'm pretty sure we all remember times when we thought we knew better than our adults, or were just trying to be sneaky and didn't care. This was the night that mindset almost resulted in me or one of my friends paying dearly for thinking that we knew better. I sometimes wonder what that guy was up to, but that thought gives me shivers, and then I do my best to put it out of my head. I'm a grown adult now, 2 kids of my own, and we still live in Washington. Given this experience, I'm hesitant to even let my kids play in our backyard alone sometimes, so I don't think we'll be having any backyard camping sessions until they're much older. Fall 2017. I was freshly 18 years old and starting my freshman year at a huge university 8 hours away from my home. Quite a lot was going on in my life, as this was the first time ever moving cities, and my first time as a young woman living parent-free after 18 years of living with limited independence in a very strict household. I was going through all the wacky culture shock and mental/emotional changes most college freshmen go through within the first few days of moving onto campus. This was my very first day of classes. After my final class of the day, which wrapped up around 6 p.m., I stopped by one of the food courts on campus to pick up something to eat. I was too hungry to wait to get back to my dorm, so I sat alone on a bench in a courtyard between 2 buildings and began to eat. Yeah, I know walking and eating alone was probably a really stupid idea, but I was naive as hell and figured that at a huge college campus, I would only be surrounded by other lost, confused students like myself. I also had no friends since I moved to the city and school, not knowing a single person, and my raging social anxiety made me hesitant to try to meet new people. Anyway, I was alone on a bench eating my food when an odd-looking couple approached me. A tall, muscular, bald man and a petite, Latina or maybe Asian-looking woman with glasses and a bob-style haircut who was holding a few books herself. The man was completely silent, but the woman enthusiastically approached me, introducing herself as Carmen in an ambiguous accent. She didn't even attempt to introduce the man, and he just stood there silently. She started asking me stuff: my name, year, where I was from, what I was majoring in, before telling me that she was from a Bible study group here in the city that, quote, a lot of college students find interest in. She opened up a Bible and started reading me some random passage before explaining it, and continuing to talk more and more about this group. She asked if I'd be interested, and I quickly shot her down by explaining that I had no time in my schedule with all my classes. I took my phone out of my pocket to check the time. At this point, she had already been lecturing me for about 20 minutes. And I made up some weird, ridiculous lie about how I had to leave immediately. That's when she snatched my phone from my hand and was like, "Wait, before you leave, I'm going to give you my contact information so you can let me know later if you're still interested." She then proceeded to put her number into my contacts. As I said, I was deep in culture shock of the whole brand new college freshman experience. I was terribly shy, and I didn't have the confidence to be assertive in this kind of situation. I just let her do her thing. She gave me my phone back, and I headed off to my dorm. I approached the communal hall and realized I didn't have my keys or wallet, even though I swore that I was holding them at the time that couple had approached me. I frantically ran back to the bench area and searched it thoroughly, went through my backpack, went through the nearby trash can. Nothing. I couldn't get into my dorm without my keys or ID, so I crumbled to the ground crying and calling my dad in a straight panic. This was my first time ever losing my keys or wallet in public, days after moving to a new city, and for an insecure 18-year-old, it felt like my life was over. My dad could only do so much to call me from 8 hours away, so he instructed me to call the campus police. I did, and an officer arrived and asked me for details of where I was, what my things look like, etc. I didn't mention the odd Bible study couple to him at all because I found myself still in such a panic. I didn't think to consider they might have had any involvement or even any way of taking my things from my backpack. I still feel very, incredibly stupid for not providing this detail. The officer gave me temporary dorm access and instructed me to contact the PD daily to check if any missing items had turned up. I was overcome with relief when I received an email 2 or maybe 3 days later from an RA in a dorm halfway across campus, saying that my keys and wallet were turned into their lost and found. I never did see that couple around campus again. I avoided going places alone other than class. A few months later, I was scrolling through social media to see multiple posts about an ongoing sex trafficking ring in the area, where the instigators would introduce themselves as Bible study groups. My stomach practically dropped to the middle of the earth. This sounded way too similar to the couple that approached me before my belongings mysteriously disappeared. Years later, I still feel like an utter and complete idiot for being more freaked out over my missing things than I was about the encounter with these two strangers. While I feel like OP in this story highlights the experience pretty well, I found that one comment paints the situation in as stark of a light as it commands. Scary. So the plan was for her to put her number into your phone while the guy pickpocketed your belongings as Carmen continued to distract you, with the hopes that you'd call them to see if they found anything on the bench after you left, and then arrange a meetup where they would have an advantage? That's so creepy and schemy, and I'm afraid to say, I think I would have walked right into it. Honestly, I think it's a blessing that in all your panic, you didn't remember this encounter. Probably saved your life. If you had, you would have called Carmen and been desperately willing to meet up, simply being so thankful that they had found your property.